I have known Gideon Cray for 31 years, and I can tell you with no hesitation and no embellishment that the man has been wrong exactly twice in his life about anything that mattered. The first time was the winter of '67, when he bet me a month's wages that the Bitter Creek would hold frozen through March. It did not hold. I collected the wages and never mentioned it again because Gideon Cray is not a man who benefits from being reminded of his errors. He squares himself up, nods once like he's agreeing with a judge at sentencing, and moves forward. That's all. The past is the past, and the cold water doesn't run backward. The second time he was wrong was the afternoon of May the 14th, 1879, when he looked up from the platform at Harlan's Spur and saw Nora Finch step off the noon train with 3 children at her heels and a carpet bag in each hand. And he said to me very quietly, "She can go right back." He was wrong about that too, but it took him considerably longer to admit it, and he never quite did, not in so many words. That's also Gideon Cray. The man speaks plainly about horses, weather, and the price of beef. Everything that matters most to him he says sideways or not at all. My name is Dolph Akers, and I have been foreman of the Coldwater Ranch since 1861. I was 32 years old when Gideon gave me the job, and I am 63 now, which means I have watched that man work through grief and drought and 2 bad winters and a range war that fortunately stayed 3 counties north of us. I know how he moves when something troubles him. I know the particular set of his jaw when he has made a decision and is daring the world to argue with it. I am telling you this story because someone ought to, and because Gideon never will. He'd sooner brand himself twice in one morning than sit down and explain how a widow woman and her 3 children dismantled every wall he'd built since his wife Alina died, board by board, without him once raising his voice to stop them. I thought it was funny at first. By the end, I thought it was about the finest thing I'd ever had a front row seat to. Let me tell you how it went. Gideon posted the notice in March. Wanted ranch cook. COLDWATR Ranch, Harlan's Spur, Montana Territory. Steady work, honest wage, quarters provided. Inquire G. Cray. He did not post it in any newspaper that might stir up the wrong sort of response. He sent it careful and deliberate to a placement agency in Billings, with a covering letter that specified, and I am quoting from memory because I proofread the thing for him, a capable woman of mature years and no dependents, experienced in feeding a working crew of 12 to 15 men, available by the 1st of May. I asked him once why he specified no dependents. He looked at me like I'd asked why a saddle needs a cinch. Because a cook with dependents has split attention, he said. The work suffers. That was Gideon's logic, and it was not wrong. It was simply incomplete, as logic about people usually is. He received 4 replies. 3 of the women were unsuitable for various reasons he declined to share. The 4th was a Mrs. N. Finch of Kansas City, Missouri, who wrote with a clean hand and firm sentences, claimed 8 years' experience cooking for a cattle operation in eastern Kansas, and listed her references with the confidence of someone who expected to be checked. He checked. The references confirmed everything she'd said. He sent a reply, she sent a reply, and by the end of April it was arranged. She would arrive on the noon train May 14th. He sent money for the ticket. What she did not put in her letters, and what he did not think to ask in his, because it did not occur to him that a woman with no dependents might have a reason for saying so, was that she was a widow with 3 children. A girl of 9 named Cora, a boy of 7 named Wheeze, and a boy of 4 named Pete. I found out later that she'd left that part out deliberately and with full awareness of what she was doing. Her previous employer's cook position had gone to a woman with no children, specifically because the rancher's wife had said she didn't want little ones underfoot. Nora Finch needed the work, so she wrote Mrs. N. Finch and left the rest to be discovered in person, when it would be harder to simply discard. She was not wrong about that calculation. Gideon is hard, but he is not cruel, and sending a woman and 3 children back on a train the same day they arrived would have cost him something. It nearly did anyway, but I'm getting ahead of myself. May 14th was a Wednesday, which is a poor day to travel anywhere in Montana Territory because the afternoon wind comes off the brakes and makes everyone miserable, and also because it was the day I usually ran the tally on the south pasture fence, which meant I was not at the depot and did not see the moment of initial contact. I heard about it from Gideon that evening, and from Charlie Rudd, the youngest of our hands, who had ridden in with Gideon to help carry supplies. Charlie told it with more enthusiasm. Boss stood on the platform. Charlie said, sitting on the bunkhouse step with his hat pushed back and his expression somewhere between delight and awe. And the train stopped, and this woman stepped off neat and proper, carpet bags in each hand, and she looked at the boss straight on, didn't flinch a bit, said, "Mr. Cray, I'm Mrs. Finch." And then. He paused for effect. Then, Charlie said, 3 little ones came down the steps behind her. The little one, the 4-year-old, walked right into the back of the boss's knees because he'd stopped so sudden, and the boss caught him without looking down and set him upright and didn't say a word for a long time. "How long?" I said. Charlie held his hat against his chest. "Long enough that the station master went back inside." Gideon's version was shorter. He told me while we checked the grain store that evening, his voice level and uninflected. "She has children," he said. "I see. 3. I heard." I said she can go back. She said she can cook for 12 men without difficulty and the children won't be in the way. He picked up a feed sack, set it down in the right place, and his back was to me. I said the notice specified no dependents. "What did she say to that?" A pause. "She said the notice specified an experienced cook and she is one, and that the children are well behaved and will earn their keep, and that she has nowhere to go back to." He straightened. "I told her she'd have 2 weeks to prove it, and then we'd revisit." I said nothing. I knew that 2 weeks in Gideon Cray's calendar was not a trial period. It was the amount of time he needed to find a face-saving way to let himself keep her on. She was installed in the cook's quarters by nightfall. The 3 children slept on a pallet she'd made up in the storeroom adjacent. By morning, she had 6 dozen biscuits ready before the hands came in, a pot of beans going on the back iron, and side pork laid out in the skillet in an amount that suggested she'd spent the previous evening counting heads. Gideon came in for breakfast and ate without comment. That, for Gideon Cray, was the highest possible praise. The children were, as advertised, not a catastrophe. Cora, the 9-year-old, had her mother's eyes and her mother's manner, watchful and contained, taking everything in before she committed to an opinion. Within a week, she had identified which of the hands were trustworthy and which were the sort to pull her braids if they thought they could get away with it. She had also quietly made herself useful in the kitchen in ways that were genuine help rather than a child's imitation of help. She peeled things when asked. She did not ask unnecessary questions. Wheeze was 7 and all energy, the way 7-year-old boys are, but he had enough sense to direct that energy at things that didn't break. He was, within 3 days, following our hand Emmett Goss around like a small shadow, asking questions about horses that Emmett answered with the patience of a man who has always wanted someone to ask. Emmett was 60 and childless and had the worst poker face in the territory, and by the end of the first week it was clear to everyone except possibly Emmett himself that he had adopted Wheeze as thoroughly as if he'd signed a paper. Pete was 4 and a problem, though not the kind of problem Gideon had anticipated. He was not badly behaved. He was simply everywhere and always underfoot, and he had formed, in the manner of 4-year-olds, an absolute and unshakable attachment to the largest and most forbidding person in his vicinity. That was Gideon. I watched it happen from the corral on the 3rd morning. Pete had escaped his mother's orbit and wandered to the fence, and Gideon was working the gray quarter horse he'd been training since February, not a gentle animal, still half-wild in his opinions. Gideon saw the boy at the fence. Any reasonable man would have sent him back to the house. Gideon stopped the horse, walked it over, crouched down to the boy's height with the horse's reins loose in his hand, and said something. I couldn't hear what. Pete reached out both hands and touched the horse's nose, and the horse, who that morning had tried to take a piece out of my jacket, stood perfectly still. Gideon brought the horse's head down another inch. I turned away because I had work to do, and because watching Gideon Cray be unexpectedly gentle with a 4-year-old was the kind of thing that, if you looked at it too long, might make you say something sentimental, and neither of us needed that. The first real collision happened at the end of week 1. Nora Finch had, in 7 days, fed 15 men 3 meals a day without once running short, kept her quarters and the kitchen cleaner than they'd been in the 3 months since our previous cook had departed for California, and had made, without announcement or fanfare, a herb garden in the strip of ground south of the kitchen door that I had not even noticed was there, until the plants were already in. She'd also, and this is the part that produced the collision, rearranged the kitchen. Not dramatically, moved the dry goods to a different shelf, put the cast iron in a different order, reorganized the spice rack in a manner that made functional sense. The previous cook had organized it in the manner of a man who had never organized anything and saw no reason to start. Gideon came in on Friday morning and stopped in the doorway. His eyes traveled the kitchen. Then they found Nora. "You moved the stores," he said. "I did," she said, not turning from the stove. "The flour was shelved above the salt and the lard. One bad bump and the salt ends up in the bread. I put the flour on the lower shelf. The flour has been on the upper shelf since 1871. That explains why the bread has been salty," she said. There was a silence that lasted just long enough for me to appreciate it. "I don't recall complaining about the bread," Gideon said. "No," Nora said. She turned then, ladle in hand, and looked at him with complete composure. "You ate it. There's a difference." She turned back to the stove. "The biscuits this morning are not salty. You can tell me at breakfast which you prefer." She did not wait for his reply. She went back to the biscuits. I was leaning in the doorway of the adjacent room, and I will tell you that in 31 years I had never once seen Gideon Cray not get the last word in a practical disagreement on his own property. He stood there for 2 full seconds, then he walked out. He ate 4 biscuits at breakfast. He did not comment on the salt. That evening I found him in the barn doing something that did not need doing, which is what Gideon does when he is processing something he doesn't want to examine. I left him alone. Some things a man needs to work out in the dark with a horse and no witnesses. By the end of the 2nd week, the trial period had passed without mention on either side. If Nora noticed this, she gave no sign. She simply continued. Her children continued. The cold water continued. The question of her going back had not come up again, and I did not raise it, and Gideon did not raise it, and eventually it settled to the bottom of things the way that questions sometimes do when the answer becomes obvious to everyone except the person who asked it. What changed was harder to name. It wasn't any single thing. It was a series of small things, like a fence built 1 post at a time. The morning Gideon, passing the kitchen, caught Pete before the boy could touch the hot iron, and held him up by his collar for a moment and said, "Irons burn," in the same flat instructional voice he used to tell the hands about a dangerous section of trail, and Pete nodded with total seriousness and was more careful after that. The afternoon Cora asked Gideon, with the directness of a child who has decided you are probably trustworthy, whether the gray horse had a name. He told her. He also told her, unprompted, why he'd named it that, which required explaining a particular canyon he'd found in the Breaks country 15 years prior, and he talked for 3 minutes without stopping, which for Gideon was the equivalent of a speech. Cora listened with her whole attention. At the end she said, "That's a good name," and he nodded once and went back to what he was doing, but he walked a little differently after. The evening we fell from the fence rail he'd been told twice not to climb, cut his chin on a rock, and cried the hard, bright cry of a boy who is more scared than hurt. Nora was inside. Emmett was on the far side of the pasture. Gideon was 10 feet away, and he moved faster than I've seen him move in years, not running, just covering ground efficiently, the way a rancher moves when something needs attending, and he had the boy up and the chin assessed and his own handkerchief applied to the cut before anyone else could reach them. He said nothing about the fence. He said, "Tip your head back," and then, after a moment, "You'll live." We stopped crying immediately, because there are boys who need comfort and boys who need to be told they'll live, and Wee's was the second kind. He walked to the house with Gideon's handkerchief pressed to his chin, wearing the expression of a man returning from a minor war. I watched all of it. I watched Gideon watch the boy go, and then watched him register that I was watching him, and then watched him very deliberately find something to look at in the middle distance until his face settled back to its usual composition. I said nothing. I am not a cruel man. Nora Finch, for her part, was careful. Not timid, she was never that, as the biscuit incident had demonstrated. But she was precise in a way I came to recognize as something earned rather than natural. She did not push where she wasn't wanted. She did not offer opinions about the running of the ranch or make suggestions about anything outside her proper domain. When Gideon was difficult, and he was sometimes in the way that grief-carrying men are difficult, when something brushes up against the bruised place and they go cold or sharp without quite meaning to, she did not flinch and she did not press. She simply continued. It was not passivity. It was patience of a specific kind, the kind that knows the difference between a man being difficult and a man being afraid. I learned her story in pieces, the way you learn most things on a ranch where people work beside each other for long days, and the evenings are quiet. She'd married young, moved to Kansas with her husband who was going to build something. He'd built a fair amount of it, actually, had a small operation going, a house, prospects. And then he'd gotten sick and died in the winter of '74, and the prospects had died with him because they were mostly his and not put in writing in a way that helped her. She'd spent 3 years after that keeping her children fed through a combination of cooking work, some teaching, and one bad arrangement with a man named Corbin who held her husband's note, and kept extending it in ways that were less about the money owed and more about keeping her obligated. When Corbin's attention had started to move from the financial to the personal, she'd taken her children and left Kansas City on a morning in April without forwarding her address. The Coldwater posting, she told me once, dry as creekbed August, was the first thing she'd answered in 5 years that didn't feel like a compromise. A ranch far enough away that he'd have to want to find me, she said, and work I know how to do. I said, did you always intend to tell Mr. Cray about the children? She looked at me over her coffee cup. I intended to show him I was worth keeping before he could say no, she said. That's not the same as intending to deceive. It was not, I agreed. It was simply tactics. June came in warm, and the long evenings opened up the way Montana evenings do, all light and space. The hands ate later. People moved slower. The Coldwater settled into its summer rhythm. I started noticing things. The way Gideon's route in the morning had shifted, almost imperceptibly, to take him past the kitchen door rather than through the barn first, so that he arrived at the day slightly later, and with a cup of coffee he'd gotten from Nora's kitchen that was better than the bunkhouse coffee by a margin not worth arguing about. The way he had, without announcing it, constructed a small set of steps for the back of the kitchen door that were the right height for a 4-year-old, so that Pete could get out to the yard without having to jump and risk his neck. He'd done it on a Sunday afternoon in the time he usually spent doing nothing, which was time Gideon had never in my memory actually spent doing nothing. The way he lingered sometimes at the kitchen table past the point of necessity, with a cup he'd finished and no apparent reason to stay, while Nora moved around the kitchen doing the things she did after supper. He didn't talk much during these times. She didn't seem to require it. They were just in the same room, and both of them seemed to find that acceptable. I mentioned it to Emmett one evening, carefully, just to see if I was imagining it. Emmett squinted at me. Boss has been sleeping better, he said. Heard him moving around at night for years, past few weeks he's not. He pulled his hat down. Woman's cooking, probably. Probably, I said. We both knew it wasn't the cooking. The trouble came at the end of July, on a Tuesday, on a day that had given no indication of being that kind of day. A man rode into the yard on a black gelding that had been ridden hard and not cared for the way a man ought to care for a horse, which told me something about the man before he opened his mouth. He was well dressed for the territory, too well, and had the careful grooming of someone who wishes to be taken for a different sort of man than he is. He asked for the owner of the Coldwater Ranch. Gideon came out of the barn. The man's name was Corbin. He did not give a first name. He said it the way men say names they expect to be recognized, as though the name alone was enough, as though everyone had already heard it and formed the appropriate impression. I'm looking for a woman traveling under the name Finch, he said. I have reason to believe she is employed here. Gideon looked at him. He said nothing. She holds a debt, Corbin said. Outstanding for 3 years, I've come to settle it. What sort of debt? Gideon said. It was not a question. It was the kind of sentence that sounds like a question, but is actually a statement about what kind of answer the speaker is prepared to accept. Corbin recited numbers with the fluency of a man who has the numbers memorized because he has used them before. The sum was not large. What was large, and what became clear as he spoke, was the interest, which had grown with a consistency that suggested it had been tended rather than merely accrued. She left without notice and without settling, Corbin said. I'm owed. Gideon let him finish. Then he said, she works for me. That's fine. She can come out and we can discuss the terms. She's not coming out. Corbin stopped. He recalibrated. His expression went through several versions of itself before settling on something that was still polite, but carried a different message underneath. Mr. Cray, I have a legal paper that establishes. Does it establish the difference between a note at standard interest and what you've got there? Gideon said. Not a question. His voice had the quality of ground that sounds solid but is actually very shallow over rock. Corbin looked at the paper he was holding. Interest is calculated at the contracted rate. Show me the contract. There was a pause. I don't have the original with me, Corbin said, but Mrs. Finch is aware of the terms. Then you don't have a paper, Gideon said. You have a number you've written on a paper. I was standing by the corral gate, and I will tell you that the quality of the silence that followed was of the particular kind that precedes one of two outcomes, and I was prepared for either. Corbin was not a physical threat. He was soft in the way that men who deal in paper are soft, but he had the look of a man who was accustomed to winning arguments through persistence. What he was not accustomed to was Gideon Cray. What she owes, Gideon said, if anything which I'm not conceding can be sent to my solicitor in Billings. You can give me your address and I'll have him write to you. If the debt is legitimate, it will be paid. A pause. If it's not, you'll hear about that too. Corbin opened his mouth. Get back on your horse, Gideon said. Corbin looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at me. I gave him nothing useful. He looked at the hands who had, in the way of ranch hands who sensed something worth watching, drifted to various visible positions around the yard. He got back on his horse. He rode out the same direction he'd ridden in, and his back had the tight set of a man who is composing what he should have said. He wouldn't come back. I'd seen enough of that type to know the limits of their persistence when the limit was clearly marked. Gideon watched him out of sight, then he went back into the barn. I gave him an hour, then I went in. She knows he was here, I said. Nora had been in the kitchen when Corbin rode in, and she'd come to the window. She wasn't there when I looked back, but the curtain had moved. Probably, Gideon said. You going to talk to her about it? He was working a piece of harness that didn't need working. He set it down. He picked it up again. She'll come to me if she wants to, he said. Gideon, I'm not going to march in there and make her explain herself. No, I said, that's not what she needs. He looked at me. She needs to know you're not going to change your mind, I said. About her being here. He was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough for a barn swallow to cross the doorway twice. Then he said, Why would I change my mind? And went back to the harness with the focus of a man who is done with the conversation. I left him to it. I knew what that question meant coming from Gideon. It meant the decision is made. It meant she is here and she will stay. It was not for him a complicated thing. It was simply the truth. The question was whether Nora knew it yet. She came to find me that evening, which surprised me. She generally didn't seek out conversations. She let them find her. She came to the fence where I was checking the gate latch and stood beside me and looked at the mountains the way people look at things when they're working up to saying something. I suppose you know about the man who came today, she said. I was standing 20 feet away, I said. She was quiet for a moment. He's been following the money for 3 years, she said. My husband's note. He extended it every time it came due and added the interest onto the principal and then charged interest on that. By the time I left, the original note was 1/3 of what he claimed I owed. She paused. I left because the debt was not the reason he kept extending it. I know, I said. She looked at me, Mr. Cray. He's not going to send you away, I said. If you're worried about that. She was quiet, not the kind of quiet that means relief, a more careful quiet. He doesn't know me, she said. Not really. He knows you well enough, I said. For Gideon, that's... I stopped. I tried to think of how to say it in a way that was honest without being more than she'd asked for. He doesn't keep things he doesn't value, I said. He's not a complicated man in that way. She was still looking at the mountains. The light was going long and gold over the peaks to the west, the kind of light that makes even practical people stop and take stock. The children are happy here, she said finally. It came out like it surprised her. I know, I said. Pete asked me this morning if the Coldwater was going to be our home. She said it carefully, the way you say something that is both wonderful and frightening. I didn't know what to tell him. I didn't say anything to that. It wasn't my answer to give. But I thought about it all the way back to the bunkhouse, and I thought about Gideon with that harness in the barn, and I thought about Pete at the corral fence with the gray horse, and I thought that the 4-year-old had probably already worked out the answer, the way children do, before anyone with better sense had gotten around to it. The thing that settled it happened the next morning. It was early before breakfast, before the hands were up. I was already out because I had a ewe with a bad foot to check in the south pasture, and I came back through the yard while the light was still low and slant, and the dew was on everything. I saw Gideon at the kitchen door. He was standing with his back to me, talking to someone. Then I came around far enough to see it was Nora, in the doorway, not blocking it, just standing in it the way she stood when she was listening to something and taking it seriously. She had a coffee cup in both hands. He didn't have anything. He was standing with his hat in one hand and doing something I had not seen Gideon Cray do in a long time, which was talking at length, plainly, without apparent strategy. I could not hear what he said from where I was. I didn't need to. I knew the shape of it. I'd known him long enough to know that when Gideon Cray took his hat off to talk to a person at their door in the early morning, the conversation was not about the fence line or the grain inventory. I changed my route and went the long way to the barn. When I saw her later that morning, Nora Finch was moving through the kitchen with the same efficiency she always had, the same clean economy of motion, but something in her face was different. The careful thing she carried, the watchfulness, the precise management of what she let the world see had loosened just slightly around the edges. Not gone. She was not the kind of woman to put that down all at once, but loosened. She caught me looking and raised an eyebrow. "Biscuits in 20 minutes, she said. "I'll be there," I said. She handed me a cup of coffee without me asking for it, which she had not done before, and went back to her work. I drank the coffee in the yard. It was Pete who said the thing that finished it. 3 mornings after the morning at the kitchen door, we were all at breakfast, Hans, Nora, the children, Gideon at the head of the table. And the conversation was the ordinary conversation of a working ranch. The weather and the fence work and what Emmett needed from the supply run. And Pete was eating his biscuit with the absorption of a 4-year-old who takes breakfast seriously. Then he looked up at Gideon, who was sitting 2 seats away from him, and said with complete seriousness, "Mr. Gideon, are you gonna be our papa?" The table went quiet. Not the embarrassed quiet of men trying not to interfere. The particular quiet of men who have all been watching the same thing develop for 2 months and are very interested in the outcome. Gideon looked at Pete. Pete looked back at him with the direct, guileless attention of a child who has asked what he considers a reasonable question and is waiting for a reasonable answer. I looked at Nora. She had gone very still, her coffee cup halfway to the table. Gideon said slowly, "What makes you ask that?" Pete considered this with appropriate seriousness. "Because you're here every morning," he said, "and you fix the steps so I don't fall, and yesterday you told we's not to climb the fence again and we's listened, which he doesn't do when Mama says it." He paused, reviewing his evidence. "And Emmett says you're the boss of everything, and the boss of everything should probably be the papa." I heard someone at the far end of the table suppress something that was not quite a cough. Gideon looked at Pete for a long moment, then he looked briefly at Nora. She was looking at the table. Whatever was on her face was not visible to me. He looked back at Pete. "I'm thinking on it," he said. Pete nodded. This was apparently a satisfactory answer. He went back to his biscuit. The table came back to life. Emmett started a sentence about the fence. Charlie asked about the supply run. The ordinary conversation resumed. I did not look at either of them for the rest of the meal, because some things you can observe too closely and it does something to them. I just ate my breakfast and listened to the sound of the Coldwater Ranch at morning, which is the sound of work being done and meals being eaten and children being present in a house that had been too quiet for too long. It was September before Gideon said anything else. Seasons on the Coldwater are not slow. There is always something that needs doing, and the summer had its own demands. The second hay cutting, a problem with the north fence line, a horse sale in Harlan's Spur that Gideon handled personally and came back from with 2 new animals, and his usual expression of mild dissatisfaction with humanity that meant he'd gotten a good deal. Nora was still there. The children were still there. The arrangement had settled into a shape that everyone on the Coldwater could see, even if the 2 people most involved in it were still, in the way of stubborn and careful people, circling it from a respectful distance. I gave it until October. I was wrong by a month. It was September the 19th, an evening I remember because the aspen on the ridge had turned that week, and the light coming through them was something you don't forget, gold and thin and clean. I was not present for the conversation. I will not pretend I was. What I know is what Gideon told me, Later that night, in the barn, which is where Gideon goes when he has said something important and needs to be somewhere familiar while he decides how he feels about having said it. He told it the way he tells things, flat and brief like a land survey, the shape of the land, not the feeling of standing in it. He'd found her at the kitchen door at the end of the evening, which was where she sometimes went to watch the dark come in over the mountains. He'd told her that Corbin's solicitor had written to his solicitor, and the debt, examined properly, had come to 1/3 of what Corbin had claimed, and it had been settled in full, and she owed nothing. She'd said she'd repay him. He'd said that was not what he meant. She'd said she knew what he meant, and that she was not the kind of woman who was comfortable receiving. He'd said he knew what kind of woman she was, and that he hadn't cleared the debt to make her comfortable. He'd cleared it because he intended to ask her something, and it would be easier to ask with the thing cleared. There was apparently a silence there, a good one. She asked what he intended to ask. He said he was not an easy man, and he knew it, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. He said the Coldwater was a working ranch, and he was a working rancher, and he did not have graceful ways about him and probably never would. He said the children were. He stopped here in the telling, and I did not push. He started again. He said the children were welcome. He said that Weez needed to stay off the fence and Pete needed to stay away from the irons, and Cora was already more useful than half the hands. And all of that, the fence climbing and the burn risk and the usefulness, all of that was the kind of thing a man thought about when he thought about a place being home to someone. When he thought about someone being home to a place. Then he said he was going to ask her to stay, not as the cook, as something else. He stopped in the telling again. I waited. She said yes, he said. His voice had the quality of a man reporting a significant weather event, precise and controlled. But his hands, when he picked up the harness he'd come in here to pretend to work on, were not quite steady. Good, I said. He worked the harness for a while. I found something of my own to tend to. After a time, he said, I should have asked sooner. Probably, I said. I thought, he stopped, started. Eliner's been gone 6 years. 7, I said. He was quiet. 7, and he stopped again. He set the harness down and looked at the wall of the barn with the expression of a man doing an accounting in his head. I thought I was past wanting, he said. I thought that was just done, settled, over. And he looked at me. Something moved through his face that I haven't seen there in a long time, not grief, but the aftermath of grief, which is different. Cleaner. Apparently not, he said. He picked the harness back up. I let him have the barn. I walked out into the September evening with the aspen light dying on the ridge, and I thought about a woman with 3 children and a carpet bag in each hand stepping off a noon train in May, and a man standing on a platform with his plans laid out neat and his mind made up, and how the distance between those 2 fixed points had turned out to be considerably shorter than either of them had intended. They were married in November, before the first snow. It was not an elaborate occasion. Gideon was not an elaborate man, and Nora, who had spent several years making do, had no interest in pageant for its own sake. The circuit preacher came through on the 14th, and the hands cleaned up, and Emmett, who had been sentimental about the whole business since approximately June, cried with the efficiency of a man who has decided that if he is going to cry, he is going to do it once and completely, and then be done. Cora stood straight and watched everything with her mother's careful eyes. Weez was permitted to hold one of the horses, which satisfied him entirely. Pete fell asleep on a hay bale during the short ceremony and had to be carried to the house, which Gideon did without comment or apparent inconvenience, the boy's head against his shoulder, and that was, if you need a single image for the whole story, probably that. The Coldwater went back to work the next day because work on a ranch does not pause for sentiment, and sentiment on the Coldwater doesn't need it to. I am telling you this now because it is the kind of story that should be told, and because I am the only one who will tell it from the beginning. Gideon will not. He is not much changed by the year, still runs the place with the same economy of motion and mild dissatisfaction with anything that's not up to standard, still moves through the Coldwater like a man who is exactly where he means to be. The children have grown into it the way children grow into good land, putting down roots without thinking about it, becoming part of the place while the place becomes part of them. Pete still follows him around. He is 5 now, going on 6, and has graduated from the corral fence to asking Gideon about the horses with the specific technical vocabulary of someone who has been given real answers to real questions and found it to his liking. The gray horse let him lead it last week. Gideon watched from 6 feet away with his arms crossed, and the expression he uses when something has met his standard, and he sees no need to say so. Cora has his ear on things he doesn't know. She told him last month that the kitchen flour bin had a crack in the seam and showed him where, and he fixed it the same afternoon without acknowledging that a 9-year-old had caught something he'd missed. She didn't need him to acknowledge it. She has, I think, taken the measure of Gideon Cray more precisely than anyone on the Coldwater, except possibly her mother. Weeze came off the fence 3 more times after the original incident and has, I believe, now genuinely internalized the instruction, which Emmett reports with the cautious optimism of a man who has been disappointed before and is not ready to celebrate yet. Nora runs the kitchen and the kitchen accounts, and has, in the past 4 months, quietly and without announcing it, also begun to run the household accounts, because she has a head for numbers and Gideon has a head for cattle and horses, and it turns out the Coldwater runs better when each person does what they're actually suited for. He noticed this after about 3 weeks and said nothing except that the March figures looked better than they had in 4 years, which from Gideon is the equivalent of a standing ovation. There is a lamp in the kitchen window now every evening, not because anyone left one, because someone always lights it. I walk past it on my way to the bunkhouse most nights, and I think about May 14th and that noon train, and the look on Gideon Cray's face on the platform when he said she could go right back. He was wrong about that. He hasn't been wrong about much since.